Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Emissary, which is episode 20 of season 2 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video I cover the episode The Emissary. So The Emissary is the episode where they receive a special emissary from Starfleet to inform them of a mission of a Klingon ship that has been in hibernation for 70 years that thinks the Federation is still their enemies, and they're in striking different distance of 5 different Federation outposts that are defenseless. And their mission is to stop the Klingons, and the Emissary is a half-human, half-Klingon woman named Kalar who has had a prior relationship with Worf, and thus their relationship is very strained, has their forced to work together to solve the current situation. They end up having a fling in which Worf demands that, says that Honor demands that they get married, but she refuses to do so, and instead she insists that there's no way to deal with the Klingon ship other than killing them. However, Worf manages to come up with a last-minute plan where he and Kalar pretend to be in command of the Enterprise in order to talk the Klingon ship down, which succeeds, and Kalar departs for the Klingon ship and they go their different ways. So the first thing I'll say about this is getting to my personal experience, and this is stuff, I've mentioned in many of my reviews before, is that I first started getting into Next Generation while Season 5 was airing, so I went back and watched a lot of episodes on reruns, and for some reason, I think since Season 4 had just aired, they were showing Season 4 on reruns, so that was the first season I really saw, and I was more familiar with all the episodes of Season 4 as I saw them a bunch of times. And so there was a lot of examples, because it made me realize just how many characters in season 4 were reoccurring characters from earlier seasons. So when I was going back and watching the earlier seasons, it was like watching the prequel or watching the origin story for, this is where Leah Browns came from, or this is where Duras came from, or this is where I don't know, different characters, Q came from. And so when I first saw this episode, I was like, this is where Kalar came from. This is the origin story. This is the prequel for Kalar, which is, again, my sort of fault for watching it totally out of order. So I had a different perspective rather than viewing this as another typical Romance of the Week episode with an old flame of Worf's, which is a storyline, if you're keeping track, that Star Trek has done a lot, where they'll have, and they've done it with Kirk at least 5 times, where they'll have a character pop up who was an ex-lover of our main character, and they have to try to get together and whatever, and they have this history. However, that's not how I viewed the episode when I first saw it. I viewed it as, this is where Kalar came from. This is the origin story of Kalar, has an already established character. So I always had a different way of looking at it. But through the years, I've learned to appreciate this episode more. This is one of the episodes that I started to like a lot more as I got older, mainly having to do with, the different way I was looking at it, judging it on its own merits and not just the prequel to Kalar, but also growing more mature and appreciating character-based stories more, and well-written romance stories more. And the thing I'll say about this episode is that, especially going through season 2 and analyzing all the different storylines in the scripts, and I've talked a lot in my recent reviews about how a lot of the scripts for season 2 were just written poorly, or not written well enough, or sort of are earlier drafts that weren't really fleshed out, and they were just shot because they were in a hurry to shoot, and really they're not well constructed or well written scripts. The last 2 episodes were very strong examples of that. Manhunt and Up the Long Ladder, both terrible scripts that were not written well and needed way more time to actually develop. But this is a rare occasion in season 2 where it was actually a very well written script. It was, you can tell that it's really tight, and really well constructed. And more than that, it's really helped by the guest performance of Susie Plaxton, who does an absolutely amazing job playing Kalar, and I think it was very evident of why they brought her back after this episode. Because she absolutely nails Kalar. I mean, this whole episode kind of hinges on the character of Kalar. Now, what's interesting is that Tracy Torme, who wrote the episode Schizoid Man, had the idea to make Dr. Solar, who appeared in that episode, a love interest of Worf. But apparently that was abandoned later on when they decided to do this episode, and so they just decided to pivot to Kalar, which Tracy Torme was very much against. He thought that was an ordinary thing to do to give Worf a half Klingon lover, because Worf is Klingon, so that was predictable. He thought it would have been more interesting and more out there if it was a Vulcan. And in fact, an early draft of the script was probably somewhat based off of that, because Kalar was at one stage considered to be half Vulcan and half Klingon, but then they just abandoned that because they thought it would be too confusing. I don't know. I think it might be too confusing. I think they would have added too much to it. Either make her Klingon and half human, or just make her Vulcan. I don't know. At this stage, I think it would have seemed off. But anyway, so they got Susie Platskin to play Kalar, who also played Dr. Solar. And to be honest, I think they did the right thing by pivoting to Kalar. Now, I get where Tracy Torme is coming from, because having a Klingon and a Vulcan together would have been more unique and would have been more out of left field. But I think Kalar is just a better character, a better written character, and Susie Plaskin plays both characters, and she really, really shines as Kalar, whereas I think she's not that memorable as Solar. Solar didn't really have that much to do in that episode, so maybe it's unfair to judge her on that, where Kalar has a lot more to do. But I think even taking in their different, their screen time into account, I think it's still very evident that Kalar is a much more compelling character. And I think maybe more up Susie Platskin's alley, because I think she just nails her. Absolutely just nails this character. And this is why I think part of why this episode is so good is that all the stars align, or however you want to say, that just match up to work for this episode, whereas with other episodes things didn't quite work out, such as with Up the Long Ladder. Where here they just managed to nail the character in the script. Susie Plaskin came in and nailed the character, and her chemistry with Michael Dorn was amazing, and it just all fell in place. And that doesn't and there was a way, this easily could have fell apart. It easily could have, if they did not get the character of Kalar just right, this episode could have very easily fell apart. But it just so happened to really work, and so I understand why they brought the character of Kalar back, because she worked so well and was so compelling. And I think it was actually bold of them to bring Kalar back, because typically, as I said, it's very typical for Star Trek to have these one-off romance, even if it's with an old flame, and then you never hear or see from them ever again. And it was kind of bold that not only did they bring her back, but they also made it so Worf actually had a son with her, and making that a permanent fixture on his character for the rest of the show. Now, granted, they did bring her back, but then killed that character off in the very same episode. And I will talk about that more when I get to that episode, which is a shame that they did that, because she said it does make, especially watching this episode, makes me regret that decision. It makes me think, as much as I love Reunion, it was in my top 25 favorite episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise, so I did a live stream on that if you're interested in checking out my thoughts on it. But yeah, because I think that's one of the best episodes of the entire franchise, but I still regret their decision to kill her off. And I think that they robbed themselves of a really great character by doing so. And Suzie Plotkin returned in Star Trek for several different roles. She played a Q on Voyager, and she played an Andorian on Enterprise. But none of her roles were as good as Kalar. None of her roles were as... I don't care about seeing her in different roles. I wanted to see Kalar because she nailed this role so well. In fact, originally she was, in fact, supposed to reappear in the season 7 episode, Firstborn, as in the dream sequence. Where she's talking to Worf, or maybe a memory, or maybe a combination of that. And the reason why it didn't happen is because her schedule didn't align, where she was busy. And again, that's a damn shame. It would have been great to see her reprise the role of Kalar, even if it was just a dream sequence. And because she's so good, and they really should have made this character a reoccurring character, who occurred a lot more frequently. I think they missed huge opportunity by not doing that. But anyway, that's getting more into the episode Reunion. So this episode begins with a poker scene, and I've been waiting, because I couldn't really remember how many poker scenes there were in season 2, and apparently the answer is 2. The first one was in The Measure of the Man, and this is the second one. And so this is the first time they brought back the theme of the poker table, sort of establishing it as a sort of reoccurring motif that will appear throughout Next Gen's run. But I didn't particularly like this poker scene all that much. It had, it's funny because the previous poker scene had Riker be the one who was like the expert player who bluffed everyone. But here they're implying Worf is the great player. He's the Iceman, as they say. Something that they don't bring up ever again after this. He just seems to be an average player after this episode. I guess he's just having a good night. That makes sense. I'll buy that. But it's funny because at the end of the episode, or at the end of the sequence, I should say, Geordi says to him, "Oh, you're bluffing," and Worf says, "Klingons never bluff." Now, and Geordi's like, "Yeah, right." But here's the thing: if Worf is being honest, then he just gave away a huge tell. Like, he just made it very easy for them to beat him in the future. And because they could, and if it's true, they were like, oh, Klingons never bluff. So this Worf, when he says he doesn't have the cards, he doesn't have the cards. So I know I can beat him because they don't bluff. Which I don't know. I just don't think that's a good line, or maybe Worf was psyching him out and pretending he didn't bluff when they sure do. But anyway, it does kind of tie into the rest of the episode because Worf, the whole thing is about how Worf is going on that you talk too much, or saying to Data they talk too much and you just talk, and let's do more action, which is what comes up between him and Kalar, where he has a really good line about how he feels people talk a lot and don't say much. Like they talk as a way, use humor or talking as a way to deflect from what's actually going on, or to hide, which is what he's implying that Kalar is doing. So that's actually a nice use of the, again, as I said, this is a tightly written script. This is a well-written script, where, this comes back into play later on. And, of course, establishing Worf as the Iceman in that opening scene, and then showing that exterior crack later in the episode was a really nice play, because you see as soon as Kalar comes on board, he's really off guard and unhinged throughout most of this episode. And I love the one scene in particular after him and Kalar had a rough session where she yelled at him, and Worf goes on the bridge and starts like yelling at the lieutenants and being like, I want to run a level 2 diagnostic, and Riker's like, well, we just did that a couple hours ago. It's like, I want to do it again. And then Picard has to go up to Worf and be like, Lieutenant, relax. And I love this scene so much where he goes, I am relaxed. And what I love about that is not just that, that funny joke of saying, I am relaxed, and just how ridiculous it is I love Picard's reaction to it. That he doesn't even, all he does is like stare at him and be like, seriously? Like, do you not listen? Do you not hear yourself right now? He just always has to do is stare at him, and Worf realizes, okay, all right, yes, I'm obviously not relaxed. And so then he goes in the holodeck and ends up, doing his little workout session with Kalar. Now, I want to backtrack a bit to get to the scene where, and this is a pivotal moment, maybe one of the biggest nitpicks I have about this episode, is when Kalar first meets the crew and briefs them in the briefing room. It's obvious, like, immediately that her and Worf have a history. Like, they make that quite a public display, really. Where she's like, Worf, aren't you going to say you're happy to see me? And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And it's very clear they have beef with each other. But then, she lays out the mission parameters of the Klingon ship and whatnot. And then they adjourn, and then Picard goes to Worf and says, I want you to work with Ambassador Kalar to, come up with alternative plans and come up with solutions to this problem. And Worf is like, perhaps Riker or Data would be better in this role. And Picard's like, well, what are your reasons? Are your reasons for this request personal? And he says, yes. Any professional reasons? And he says, no. And then Picard just stares at him. He's like, I withdraw my request, sir. Now, some people like this scene or would praise Picard for this, but I actually think this is bad captaining on Picard's part. And I further think that this is something that later Picard, like season 3 through season 7 Picard, wouldn't do. I think this is kind of bad captained because first 2 seasons Picard is a bit grumpier than what they would make Picard later in the show, and I think this is an example of them just being grumpy, and I actually think this is a bad command decision. The implication here is, Worf is letting his personal feelings interfere with his duty, and that's not acceptable, and so I'm reminding him not to let your personal feelings interfere with your duty. And that's why I think some people agreed with Picard's take on the situation. But I think what plays out in the episode later on proves that Picard did the wrong thing, because personal feelings, and it's obvious from that display that he just saw that those feelings isn't just on Worf's side, that it's mutual between Kalar and Worf, and that they both have personal feelings, strong personal feelings for each other that could interfere with their work, which is exactly what happens. Because when they go to do their meetings about trying to brainstorm solutions on how to solve the current crisis, they don't talk about the current crisis at all. Instead, they hash out their personal feelings, which is exactly why you don't want to have these two working together, because their sessions together are entirely unproductive. They're also heated because of the personal feelings that they have towards each other, and so they're distracted, they're caught off guard, they're not productive at all. So as a course of simply being a captain who's trying to do the best for productivity and doing the best to solve this crisis, which is a crisis, he made a very bad command decision by ignoring Worf's personal feelings, and obviously Kalar's personal feelings as well, because it should have been obvious that those personal feelings would interfere with the efficiency of doing what's best for the mission. So this is actually very bad captaining, and this is something I was kind of distracted with for the entire episode, that Picard is a bad captain in this episode by saying, oh, fuck your personal feelings, Worf, come on, do your job, is not the right, correct, efficient way to do things. Worf's suggestion to have Riker or Data be involved was actually a really good one. Because if it had been Riker or if it had been Data working with Kalar, they wouldn't have been sitting there talking about their feelings the whole time or yelling at each other or being upset. They would have actually focused on the actual mission, which is what Picard would have wanted. In fact, they don't get anything accomplished until Worf brings Data in to sort of distract Kalar from, talking personal and forcing them to deal with the issue. That's when they finally actually get some work done. So Picard's a bad captain in this episode. I'm sorry, he is. That line, some people seem to like it, where he was like, oh, any personal reasons, any professional, well, and just stare at you. Well, there you go. That's actually terrible captaining. He should have been like, oh, any personal reasons? And Worf was like, yes. It's like, okay, I understand. I want to do what's best for the mission and what's best, so I'll assign someone else. That would have been good captaining, instead of just being a dick and staring at Worf and being like, oh, fuck your personal feelings. It's not very practical. And because during the actual briefings between Kalar and Worf, she's just yelling at him the whole time. Then we had that one scene where she's like, there are no other options, and Worf is like, there are always options. And then she has this really heavily sarcastic response where she's like, yes, in view of my official standing, in view of all available options. She throws that word in his face like that. My original recommendation stands. Dismissed. Anyway, she's being entirely unprofessional, by the way. I think a lot of why those meetings don't work is due to her more than Worf. Just FYI. Anyway. But anyway, it does make for good drama, though. And they do need to do that in order to create more dramatic tension in the episode. Another thing that I've been noticing as I've been going through Season 2 is that the writers haven't really figured out Worf yet, and that Worf comes off a bit differently in Season 2 than he will in future seasons. Now, Season 1 he barely appeared in. He was just a guy who would pop up occasionally and go, I'm a Klingon, sir. So they tried to at least give him a little bit more of a personality in Season 2. Well, now that he'd been promoted to Chief of Security. But I didn't really realize, just watching one episode here or there, it's not that noticeable that they didn't get his character right. But when I watch every episode in order and pay close attention to it, I can really see it. That I don't know how to describe it. He comes off as more sort of, he's always trigger happy. He's always suggesting the fire phases and whatnot, but he seems more angsty, I suppose, and less professional, whereas in later seasons he seems more professional and just, I don't know, more dynamic, I suppose is another word to it. And so I was curious to how he would come off in this episode, because from memory I remember this being a good episode. So I was curious that if he would still come off as not quite right. And I think this is probably when they first really started to correct his character. I think they did get him a bit right, and in this episode he actually is a bit closer to the Worf that we know from future seasons. And maybe not exactly, but I think this is when they first really started to nail his character down. And as I said, like, they do some nice little nuanced things, such as the Iceman bit at the start and feeding into him saying, "I am relaxed," and when he was obviously very upset, and tying into his complex feelings for Kalar, which again, the chemistry between Michael Dorn and Susie Plaskett really, really helps tremendously with this. Now, you have, and I think one of the things they nail so right that will become a huge staple of Worf is his diehard sort of devotion to Klingon culture. Which is what you get in this episode, because he, does the nasty with Kalar, but then immediately after he proposes and wants to marry, because that's what tradition demands, and Kalar is against it, mainly because she's like, wait a second, hold on, like, let's think of this logically and let's talk this over and see how this will affect our lives. Yeah, we had sex, but it doesn't mean we instantly gotta get married. Let's talk about this like a human. And Worf is like, no, absolutely not. Klingon honor demands that we take this oath, and so that's what I'm going to do. Now, there's been a question of consistency. Like, is this actually consistent for Klingon culture to have this be a tradition that once you have sex, you got to get married? And I think with the frivolousness of some of the Klingons, especially the casual way in which they talked about sex in the episode of Matter of Honor, for example, which would also continue forward for future episodes, such as the one where they're in a Klingon ship in Deep Space Nine with Martok and all that, whatever that episode's called, I can't remember. But anyway, like, they would seem to have a more sort of frivolous attitude towards sex than if you do it, you gotta get married. But I can headcanon this away for several things, that maybe it is a traditionalist Klingon tradition. That's not to say that all Klingons everywhere practice this the way that Worf wants to, but it could be more of, say, religious fundamentalists or Catholics who present day feel that way, that if you have sex, you got to get married, or that you shouldn't have sex until after you get married. That is not a common belief in Western American culture, but is one that exists in certain subsects of religious cultures. And so perhaps that's what this is. Perhaps this was, originally a hard and fast Klingon tradition that everyone lived by, but no one really lives by it anymore. But Worf wants to. And this is why I think, even though this is all headcanon, I just made it up, it fits, because Worf would be established, and this is really something they submit like later on, as someone, because he was raised by humans on Earth, that he tries very hard to be a Klingon. And he didn't actually grow up in Klingon culture. He grew up reading about Klingon culture. He grew up studying Klingon culture. And so he knows, of what he knows from Klingon culture is from like studies, from experience, or from not from experience. And so that Klingons who actually grew up in Klingon culture probably do not hold steadfast to these traditions, but because Worf is trying so hard to be Klingon, that this would be his attitude. And he would say, And Kalar, of course, did not grow up as a Klingon. She grew up half human and sort of more, and grew up on Earth, I believe, and so she grew up more as a human, and so wasn't obsessed with Klingon culture the way that Worf was. And so I think her reaction of being dismissive of it is actually probably most Klingons would be just as dismissive, that Worf is really behaving as a Christian fundamentalist in this case because he's trying so hard to be a true Klingon that he and this is, I think this would come up later on in Redemption as well, that they make it clear that he tries so hard to be Klingon that most Klingons just experience being Klingon, and they're not as obsessed with sticking to these traditions and rules. And so in that case, I think it would make sense that I think that scene actually does fit a lot into his character and works a lot for the episode. And I like how after she rejects him, he, brings in Data and kind of just ignores her and pity paddles. But then you have that really nice scene. And this is why I think this is such a powerful romance episode and why this episode works so well. You have the nice scene at the end of the episode after there was all the situation where Worf tells O'Brien to fuck off so he can beam Kayla over and have a private conversation with her. I like that scene, by the way. Worf is just like, "You are relieved," and O'Brien's like, "What?" Oh, I guess, I don't know. Guess I'll just fuck off, I suppose. But anyway, but he has that private conversation with Kalar where he says, "I will not be complete without you," and I think he believes that. And so I think part of why he was asking her to marry him wasn't just tradition. I think he was in some way using that as an excuse that really he loves her and wants to be with her. And I think Kalar was off-put by his traditionalist stance, and that's what made her reject him. But I think if he had approached it and if he had just been honest with his feelings and been honest with her and being like, "Look, I do love you and I want to spend more time with you," she would have been more receptive to that approach. I think his approach and this is his way of deflecting, of hiding, because he talks about how people talk a lot to hide, but he has his own way of hiding and deflecting, and is behind Klingon traditions, is definitely one of them. That was off-putting to her. And so that's why I think the next time we see them in the episode Reunion, she does want to marry him. She agrees to marry him. But of course, the situation gets more complicated then. They had their chance now and they screwed it up. But anyway, is because she had years to think about it. And, 2 years, a year and a half. But really, she had the time to think about it and realized how Worf really felt about her and why he really said that, and realized that she felt the same way about him. So this is such a great written, complex relationship. I dare say the best the show has done to this point. Much better than, say, We'll Always Have Paris, which was too simplistic, and while there were gems of good ideas in that episode, not nearly as complex and nuanced as this relationship here. Now, you also get the scene where Worf pretends to be the captain of the Enterprise to talk the Klingon down, which is a really great scene. And again, it shows that Worf knows Klingon culture and he's able to use it to act the way a Klingon would act, which really caught these Klingons off guard because they thought that they were, attacking Starfleet, and who they saw as the enemy. To see Klingons on board acting like Klingons just really threw them off. And I like how Worf, in real life, Picard's doing everything he possibly can to not kill them. Where in Kalar, it's like that's impossible. But Worf isn't going to behave that way because he would behave the way Klingon would be. And it's like, look, you can either lower your shields or you can die in ignorance. It makes no difference to me. Like, and that was such a great sort of, and again, it defies what Worf said at the start of the episode that Klingons never bluff, because he's totally bluffing right here. It was, so that too was a really great scene. Now, I've heard some people had issues with the storyline with the Klingon sleeper ship because it doesn't make that much practical sense. Like, what was their mission? Why would they send a ship to attack, to go in hibernation for 70 years, then attack the enemy, when presumably through those 70 years, the enemy's technology would have advanced far beyond theirs. It doesn't make any sense. And what exactly was their mission was never made clear. But here's the thing, like, none of that stuff bothers me. Now, first of all, I don't think that they were purposely sending on the mission to attack outposts, because those outposts didn't even exist when the ship was sent out. I think it was just I think the mission they were sent on had nothing to do with the war in Federation or anything. It's just the fact they wake up and find their enemies all around them. They're like, oh, we gotta attack them. I think that their mission had nothing to do with Starfleet. I think it was something else. But what exactly that mission was, I don't particularly care. Like, I'm fine, because Kalar even dismisses that in this episode. It's like, well, it doesn't matter what their mission was, they're here now, which is the point of the episode, and I think that is a point well taken. First of all, I don't think it's impossible, the situation. Like, some people apparently thought the storyline was terrible because it's dumb that there would be a hibernating Klingon ship. I don't think it's impossible. It's perfectly possible. It's fine. Do we need to know exactly why? No, I don't think we need to know why, because it's not important to the plot. The story is about Kalar and Worf. And this side plot about the Klingon ship is really just something to service that story, and I'm perfectly fine with that. As I said, it's not jarring, it's not out of place, or it's not full of plot holes. It's just they never fully explain it, and I'm happy with that, because they don't need to, because it's not the point of the episode. We get as much explanation as we need. They're there now, and they think the Starfleet's their enemy, and they're going to attack the colonies. That's all we need to know. We don't need to know the original mission. We don't need to know any specific, reasons or what happens afterwards with them. None of that's relevant, because the episode's not about them. It's about Kalar and Worf, and that's something that they pull off extremely well. So, So I think this episode works. So we gotta mention Worf's calisthenics program, which was first introduced in Where Silence Has a Lease, where he and Riker did the exercise, which was very personal to him. And so it was a nice setting for that to be what Kalar found and started reenacting, and what led Worf and Kalar to hooking up. And I have to say, I thought it was a really great scene when Kalar is doing the calisthenics program and killing the alien monsters, and Worf comes in, and she just looks at him and is like, really, is this it? Is that all the program is? It's really, it's not, is this all you can do? And so he just looks at her, and I like the long pause. He just walks for a bit. He looks at her, and then doesn't respond to her. Instead, calls out the computer and says, "Computer, level 2." And just gives her his look like, oh no, he's going to get a lot more badass than this. And then the music kicks in, and it's really exciting, and the monsters pop up again and start screaming. I thought that that was actually really cool. That was a really cool scene. In fact, I loved the music that they used to. The music is what really sold it too. It's really sold the excitement of it. I think without that music, it wouldn't have seemed as dangerous or as exciting. But as soon as Worf says level 2, and then the exciting music kicked in, really great. Now, I've been talking a lot about the music and how we've been, sometimes it's Ron Jones, sometimes it's Dennis McCarthy, and typically whenever I notice music that I really like, it's usually Dennis McCarthy, and sometimes music I don't like so much turns out to be Ron Jones, and so I looked up who did the music for this episode, and it was Ron Jones. So this is a case where I actually did, the music I really liked actually did turn out to be Ron Jones, which I'm just pointing out because everyone else seems to love Ron Jones and thinks he's the best, and that Dennis McCarthy sucks, but I actually seem to prefer Dennis McCarthy. But in this case, it was Ron Jones. So I don't always dislike his music. Sometimes I do really like it. And so I thought his music did really work in this particular case. And I thought we are always told that the Klingons start having sex or making out and get all horny over fighting and killing monsters and fighting and stuff, and usually that just seems kind of silly or out of place, or Klingons being dumb or whatever. But I think in this scene they sold it pretty well. They really sold how Kalar and Worf could go from the excitement of killing these monsters to the excitement of wanting to jump each other's bones. I thought this is probably, even more so than the Worf and Dax stuff and Deep Space Nine, is probably the best sold scene of Klingon, sexual tension that comes from fighting. I think it was actually done extremely well in this episode. So I had said before in my Revisited for a Matter of Honor that we didn't get another Klingon episode until Sins of the Father. But then I forgot about this episode. But you know what? I think I'm actually going to stand by that statement, because I don't think I'd call this a Klingon episode. I mean, it kind of sort of is, but it's not in the same way that A Matter of Honor or Arsenal of Freedom, Heart of Glory, or Sins of the Father are. I think this is an episode with Klingons in it, and it certainly does touch on Klingon culture, and it does help develop it. But I don't think the main focus, it's more of a Worf episode than a Klingon episode, and I think there is a slight distinction to have there. So I think I stand by my statement that they didn't really get into a full-on Klingon episode until next season with Sins of the Father. But anyway, I would like to thank all of those that support me on Patreon. Is very much appreciated. It does help me continue with the channel. I'm very humbled, very thankful for everyone's support. So I'll just give a quick shout out to Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Matty Jester, Joe Lavals, Alessandro Migalisio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neil Howells. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. Very much appreciated. Okay, so we have a couple Patreon comments for this episode. First comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, "You are the Kalar." I see what you did there, kind of referencing, DS9 Emissary. I get it. Anyway, one of the few truly gems out of the late second season. This episode that centers on Worf and a former acquaintance he knew, their bonding, and her independence, telling Worf in a truly feminist way she will not simply marry just because they are mated, is strong. It almost makes why she is there the B story, even though how they handled convincing the Klingon ship that was asleep, at least not heading to the Delta Quadrant on a fundamentalist quest, strong. Yeah, don't even mention that Delta Quadrant BS. Anyway, Yes, for someone who came onto the Enterprise incognito in a trip where even the worst of coach is a luxury and yet have numerous wardrobe changes, guess she went all out on the replicator, is a bit nonsensical, but it was great to have a scene between her and Troy discussing being a mixed species. Perhaps one of the very rare times they remembered that aspect of Troy, and no, I am not counting the loss. I'll give it 8 decades and beyond of Klingon winks out of 10. Yeah, it's a good point. There's something I forgot to talk about is the scenes between Troy and Kalar. Those were actually quite good. That where she was able to relate of being half human and half something else. And then they had the nice scene where Troy came in and said to Kalar, "Oh, you're upset," and she's like, "Oh, did your empathic senses tell you that?" Oh yeah, that and destroyed table right in front of me. So that was a good aspect of this episode. So next comment is from Greg Marley, who says, "This is maybe one of the first stories to really flesh out Worf's character in a serious and meaningful way. I like Kalar's matter-of-factness and humanitarian-tudes that the actress is electrifying and really makes this episode work." I agree. I think Susie Plaskin really elevates this episode. That if they had a lesser actor playing Kalar, this episode would fall flat. Totally agree. Anyway, next comment is from Kyrie091, who says, "I've accidentally started this episode thinking it was Emissary, the DS9 pilot, and then I got sad because it's actually season 2 of TNG." Okay, I mean, that's fair, but to be fair, this is actually a good episode. I think it's just as strong as the DS9 pilot, if I'm being frank, in different ways, to be sure. But yeah, TNG of Season 2 is definitely inferior to anything DS9 did, that's for sure. But this is actually a good episode. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky, who says, "Funny story, when I was writing my opinion on this episode, I thought that this was the pilot episode of Deep Space Nine, but then I remembered that TNG had the same title in the second season with Worf and Kalar. I can't wait to get to Deep Space Nine. Anyway, I have to say that this was a great episode and the second best episode of the season behind Measure of the Man. I also consider this the first great Worf-centric episode, and it really fleshes him out more. The chemistry between Worf and Kalar were great and entertaining, and I always believed their romance and interactions. The plot towards the end with Worf as the captain and in order to fool the other Klingon ship, in order to not destroy the Federation outpost and the ships, was quite great and a badass moment for Worf. Overall, a great episode and one of the few gems, and yes, I like this better than Q Who because there isn't many flaws like that episode has. So my rating is a 9 out of 10. Yes, Ricky, I think me and you might be the only ones who like this better than Q Who. But I totally agree. Q Who had way more flaws. That Q storyline was so flawed and made no sense anyway. I already talked about Q Who several times. But as far as getting this confused with the Deep Space Nine episode Emissary, well, here's the thing. The word "the" is in this episode. See, that makes the difference. The Emissary as opposed to Emissary. And it's like the Predator versus Predator. Like you might say, "Oh, I want to watch The Predator," so you go to watch, Arnold Schwarzenegger classic. Instead, you get this 2018 piece of shit crap movie because you didn't notice that the word "the" is in there. And Arnold Schwarzenegger was just Predator, not The Predator. Yeah, that whole thing is stupid. Just come up with a different episode title. I get that Emissary was a very important title for Cisco, but still call your episode something else. Because it's already there. There's already an episode. It's like First Contact. They've done it so many times. There was an episode called First Contact. There was a movie called First Contact. There was a Lower Decks episode, I think it was called First Contact. I think I talked about it before and I didn't notice they had the word first twice. And there's a Prodigy episode called First Con-Tac. Get it like it's a con? Just come up with different titles. Stop using the same titles over and over again. It's not hard. Anyway... next comment is from Brandon Neilhouse that said, well, I realized this was the episode where Kaylar first appeared, and she's a dynamic character. I always found it fascinating how much more relaxed she is about being Klingon/human hybrid than B'Elanna Torres would ever be, but that's another conversation. I do enjoy the banter during the poker game, but why does Data not know what fold means? Yeah, that is ridiculous. He should know what that means. Anyway, why are there no starships available on Starbase 153? I cannot watch Worf's calisthenics program without seeing Gordon and Malloy killing Justin the Org in the first episode of The Orville. Well, yeah, that's... interesting that you would say that because I never think of the Orville. I kind of erased that from my memory. It's just plagiarism. Anyway, I wonder why Kaylar and Worf fight with swords rather than batless. Well, Brandon, I can answer that question for you. It's because batless hadn't been introduced into the show yet. It hadn't been invented yet. That's the real answer. Anyway, I think that was the episode Reunion, actually, was the first time they invented batless. I talked about that in a live stream I did for that episode. Anyway, I've heard it said that Worf was a virgin before and Kaylar made it, and that's why he insisted that Kaylar marry him, but I don't believe this. I don't believe it either, Brandon. I think that's BS. Anyway, why have the Klingons on the Tong been in stasis for at least 75 years? This seems to be asking for trouble to me. The finding and encounter with the crew of the Tong are at least interesting thing about the episode to me. No matter how many times I watch this episode, I always wonder what sort of reception Kaylar received when the revived Klingons discovered that she's half human and gasp, a woman as well. This is a very fine episode despite its flaws. 7 bleeding Klingon hands out of 10. I don't think they care that she's a woman. I think Klingons have been portrayed as not being particularly sexist. I don't know. They're often on about this. There was a mention in Redemption how women aren't allowed to serve on the council, but then later would seem to, I don't know, contradict this. And Worf would always talk about how women are like the warriors that you serve and go to battle with. So I think I don't know. I think Trek's been kind of inconsistent on that, actually, whether or not Klingons are misogynist or not. But anyway, the half-human thing, yeah, that they wouldn't be that big on, but who says they have to find out? I mean, that's what are they going to do? Take a medical scan of there? Come on, they're Klingons. They're not going to bother with that shit. But I did, at first, I was like, when I first saw this episode, I was feeling a bit anxious for her. I was like, oh, what are they going to do when they have her alone? But, that was actually silly of me because I didn't realize, hey, the episode's over now, so she'll be fine. Everything's fine because that's the end of the episode and it's all going to happen off screen, so everything is going to be okay. So I should have realized that. Duh. They're fine. But anyway. So my rating for the Emissary out of 10 is going to be an 8. Extremely good. And it's a very strong 8. I don't think this episode was quite strong enough to get a 9. Not quite. It's still... I mean, there were things such as Picard telling Worf that any personal reasons or whatever, which that really bugs me. That was a bad captaining decision on his part. And then Kaylar's being a little obtuse and not doing her fucking job and just arguing with Worf instead. And, little things like that. And there wasn't enough meat on the bones on the main storyline with the Klingon sleeper ship either to propel it to a 9. But a very strong 8. Still the chemistry between Worf and Kalar worked out like so well. Susie Plotkin did an absolutely amazing job performing as Kalar, and I realize how tall she is in this episode as well. Although she is a bit skinny and lanky for a Klingon, though, but she's only half Klingon. But anyway, the chemistry between her and Michael Dorn was just amazing. The structure, the way the script was written, that really explored the relationship, was done well. Then the vast majority of one-off romance episodes, the chemistry just flew between these characters, and it really drove the whole episode. Made her, as I said, Kalar, a very memorable character that I'm disappointed they didn't bring back more often. Like, they really could have had something with her. And they should have taken advantage of it. But, yeah, still a very strong episode. One of the better episodes of Season 2, for sure. So that's it for my review of The Emissary. So just a quick see what's going on with my schedule coming up on my channel. Let's see. So this coming Monday will be my review for Peak Performance. And then Wednesday will be my review for Shades of Grey. And then I will be done that will actually finish up my coverage of Season 2. And then Saturday I will be back to formalize that conclusion with my ranking of all the episodes of Season 2. A new tradition I'll be doing whenever I finish the season. So I'll rank all the episodes of Season 2 from my least favorite to my favorite. And then Monday, coverage of Season 3 commences, and I'll start that off with a video where I examine the writing of Season 3. Before I get into any specific episodes, I'm going to release a video on just making commentary on the writing in Season 3. So that will be a fun thing to explore. So that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to check it out for all those videos, and also doing many more Star Trek videos and many other videos and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.